So I'd just like to say thank you to the audience. Good afternoon here in Scotland and the rest of the UK. Good morning if you're in India or anywhere else in the subcontinent, obviously, and welcome to this event from the Asia Scotland Institute. As you know, my name is Martin Perbrick. We have Roddy Gow, chairman and founder of the Asia Scotland Institute, Rick Minchon also, and from the Defence and Security Forum, Lady Olga Maitland, who'll be joining the discussion and asking some questions of William. So we're going to talk about Afghanistan again, which is it's a subject uppermost in our minds for quite a few weeks already. And William Dalrymple will give his views on the history, which I think are unique, and he's a unique commentator. It's always a pleasure to have someone from Scotland coming back to talk to the Asia Scotland Institute. And William was, I understand, brought up at the shores of the Firth of Forth. I'm not sure where. But
North Berwick.
Berwick, sorry.
North Berwick.
North Berwick. Oh no, not quite the shores of the Firth of Forth, but
North Berwick, directly on the shores of the Firth of Forth.
Yeah, yeah. And a cold place at this time of year as well. I think you all know his work.
Brothers are all in their woolies.
I should hope so. So are we. Yes. I won't mention all of your work, William, because I think everyone on this call knows it very well. You have a big following here, but I think the last two books are of particular, last three books of particular interest to us. Obviously, Return of a King, which I think you published in 2013 on the First Anglo-Afghan War, probably the defining work on that that conflict and the sad episode that it was, that you would hope would teach everyone some lessons about Afghanistan, but perhaps not, as I'm sure you'll tell us later. And most recently, I think 2019, The Anarchy. And just in case anyone doesn't have it or needs to recognize it in the bookshop or in on Amazon, there it is. Sorry, it doesn't quite show with my screensaver, but the
disappearing book, yes.
Yes.
Do you mean you're not really sitting on Calton Hill after all? This is very disappointing.
It's a bit chilly on Calton Hill, I can tell you that, but no. So just to remind everyone in the audience, so we're on Zoom webinar today, so your videos and microphones can't be seen and heard, and only the panelists. But we do want to hear from you, and we'd like to put your questions to William. So please could you raise questions in the Zoom chat function, and we'll get through as many as we can after the discussion with Roddy and Olga. And perhaps if I could hand over there, Roddy, would you like to start off and take us through your questions for William?
I would. Well, Willie, thank you again for agreeing to do this. This cameo appearance from Oxford. I'm in America. Olga is in London. And Rick and Martin are in Scotland, in Edinburgh. So you've got a global audience, quite apart from all the people who are listening in and watching. So thanks for doing this. And you and I both know, having been to a distinguished college at Cambridge, that those who don't study history know nothing, and those that do study history get pretty depressed. And I want to just sort of position our chat together, and I'll talk to you to start off with, and then later Olga will come in. We all feel that it's very important for people to see Afghanistan in its historical context, as a country that seems never to have been conquered. Can we look at the past, consider the present, and speculate about the future together? And perhaps start by saying, is Afghanistan really a homogenous country at all, or just a collection of tribal territories that over the years have been much tramped over?
Well, first of all, obviously, Afghanistan has been conquered. The problem is if you're a Western Christian colonial power, in that situation, it's much more difficult to conquer Afghanistan. And it has never been subjugated by any imperial power, whether it's the East India Company, the British Raj, the Russians, the Soviets, or the Americans. But go further back in history, of course, Afghanistan has been conquered not once, but many times, and has been part and an important and central part of many empires. Going back to ancient history, Alexander the Great held it very successfully, and the Bactrian Greeks, which followed after his conquest, held on to it. And there were Bactrian Greek rulers right up until about the time of Christ. So we're talking, from 325 BC, when the conquest began, to the last centuries, the last decades BC. A series of rulers with extraordinary names like Heliocles of Kabul and Menander of the Punjab. ruled, often in their coins looking incredibly like their British successors 1,500 years later. Some of the tetradrachms, which were the Greek batching Greek coins, have hat headwear that look incredibly like solar topes, and you see these pictures of Demetrius and Eucrides, and they look exactly like sort of club gentlemen on the edge of their clubs from the 19th century. Then again, the Kushans who succeeded the Bactrian Greeks, the Scythians, and then a succession of Islamic dynasties, the Arabs, and finally the Mughals, all succeeded in taking Afghanistan. But Afghanistan as a unit only comes into history with the rise of a man called Ahmed Shah Durrani. And Ahmed Shah was a bodyguard for another conqueror from Persia called Nadir Shah Afshar. And Nadir Shah was the guy who famously, from a very humble background, born on the borderlands of modern Iran and Afghanistan. Father was a hat maker, made fur hats near Herat. But young Nadir Shah rose to incredible heights in the Persian Safavid armies, overthrew the Safavids, and then looking for money to fight his real enemies, who were the Ottoman Turks and the Russians, he invaded Mughal India. And it was Nadir Shah who first robbed the Kohinoor, the Darya-Noor, and the Peacock Throne from India, along with 8,000 wagons of jewels, all the stuff that the Brits would have loved to have looted had they got their hands onto it, but it had already been pitched by the Persians in 1739. And in the end, Nadir Shah sort of turned into a sort of crazy megalomaniac, building piles of skulls across Central Asia. And in the end, his own cousins and his own staff assassinated him. And on the night of the assassination, allegedly, his mistress Chuki gave the Kohinoor to the head of the bodyguard, Ahmed Shah Durrani, as a present to thank him for protecting her. And he goes off and he founds the modern state of Afghanistan using the Kohinoor as collateral, the same stone that's now in the Queen Mother's throne, Queen Mother's crown in the Tower of London. Was Nadir Shah's security for taking massive loans, which he Ahmed Shah Durrani security for the massive loans which he took to establish the Afghan state. And he established a state on the ruins of three previous states. First of all, Nadir Shah's state in Persia, the Uzbek state in the north, and the Mughals in the south. So Afghanistan, the present borders of Afghanistan were really quite clearly defined by, I don't know, about 1850. There were no changes in the borders between then and now. So compared with many nations, Afghanistan actually is quite an ancient country. Its current borders have been exactly the same for 150 years, and there's been a country very similar in shape for 250 years. And yet, you are right, it's not a country which has ever really been successfully centrally controlled. The tribes, because of their tribal structure, because of the geography, and the ease with which people in distant hill valleys and mountains can ignore the central government in Kabul, it has always been a country which has, whoever is ruling it, of whatever complexion, and whether an outsider or an insider, or a tribal chieftain or a parvenu, whoever's ruling it, has always found it difficult to establish control from Kabul in the distant corners of the country. And there's a whole variety of sayings in Pashto and other Afghan languages which reflect this. They call it Yagistan, the land of rebellion. There are little phrases like every man is a Khan, every man is a lord, or thinks himself a lord. Behind every hillock there lies a Shah. And so this notion that this is a particularly difficult country to bring into central control is something that is a continuum through Afghan history. And there are, in fact, only a couple of moments, really, one under Dost Muhammad, probably, and another under the Iron Emir, Abdul Rahman, in the 19th century, both of them, when you have really brutal, effective control from Kabul and everyone standing to attention and listening. And almost all other times, it's been a remarkably diffused country where authority has been filtered through a whole variety of tribal leaders and not leaders appointed by the government.
And Willie, historically, why was it such a desirable place to have and to hold, which people did for a bit and then failed to hang on to?
Well, everyone has always thought that Afghanistan looks a very desirable place to hold from a distance. And so if you're sitting in a war room in Whitehall or a gentleman's club in Pall Mall or an officer's mess in St. Petersburg or indeed a bar in Washington, Afghanistan on the map is an incredibly attractive place to try and conquer because it controls all the routes in and out of Central Asia. On one hand, you've got China, on the other hand, you've got Iran, to the north, you've got the Stans, particularly Uzbekistan, and to the south, you've got Pakistan and India. Hold that, and Central Asia, so you think from your gentleman's club, is in your hands. And so it's always attracted ambitious conquerors of every complexion. The trouble is that, according to another Afghan or Pushtu saying, Afghanistan is a country only of stones and men. And what has been a constant feature, first with the East India Company in the 1840s, then with the British Raj, then with the Russians, and finally with the Americans, is not that you can't conquer the country, which everyone has done with great ease. It's that you can't pay for your occupation. Now, if you conquer Bengal, there is a whole range of very rich Bengali merchants you can tax. The people are rich from 2 harvests a year. If you conquer Iraq, you can export the oil and take it as your own asset and pay for the occupation by using the oil. But in Afghanistan, what every successive invader has found, that it's an incredibly expensive place to hold. So whether you're the East India Company heavily in the black because of the opium trade to China, which is making a vast fortune for a whole series of future Jardine Matheson people, or whether you're the Raj later on, or whether you're an American, it costs a lot to bring in food, to bring in weapons, to keep troops safe inside fortified dwellings, to build communications, whether it's helicopters or main roads. And yet you're not getting anything out of the country in terms of taxes. So the East India Company goes massively into the red, having been in profit. The Raj finds it impossibly expensive. The Americans find that it's electorally impossible. The Russian economy tanks. Today, someone's just pointing out in the questions, what about mineral deposits? It's true. There are some very important mineral deposits. There is the world's largest copper mine in Logar, and there are a whole series of rare earths. One of the great mysteries, I think, of the failure of this current occupation is that we managed to spend so much money and not ever seem to think that this was a country which could be exploited to pay for it. So, America knows all about rare earths. The computer screen I'm speaking at this moment is made from a series of incredibly rare earths, which is why one can touch it and the touch screen works. But for some reason, the sums simply weren't done in Washington. And it ended up that the people who bought the rights to the Mezainat copper mine and to the rare earths were actually the Chinese, who obviously didn't have a single soldier on the ground and didn't have to shoot a single bullet to secure their gains.
Very interesting.
So I think that as we all know, the big winner of the last 2 months has not been the West, has not been the Afghan people, certainly. It's been the Chinese, who are showing every sign of offering now to extend their Belt and Road project into Afghanistan and to be able to pull out the mineral resources without putting a single boot from the People's Liberation Army into the country.
Very interesting. Can you recall and tell us about Harold Macmillan's advice to Anthony Eden?
allegedly, Macmillan said, and this, I mean, well, first of all, we have to say what he had to say, and the background to this is the catastrophic failure of the first Anglo-Afghan War in 1839. Very basically, the British marched 100,000 Indian troops, largely, with a few white officers, up into Afghanistan. They successfully held Kabul and a few other strong points like Jalalabad and Kandahar for about 18 months, and then the tribes rose in rebellion. And while the garrisons in Jalalabad and Kandahar were okay, the ill-led garrisons in Kabul, led by a particularly unpleasant and incapable officer called Shelton, and his boss, Elphinston. I'm sure, Roddy, you know many Elphinstons in Edinburgh, where indeed the family were from, failed spectacularly to defend their cantonment, which they had placed very foolishly on the valley floor, where indeed the American embassy lies today, in a completely indefensible spot overlooked by hills on every side. And as soon as the rebellion broke out, the insurgents merely had to haul captured cannon up onto the hills above and shoot down into cantonment until everyone surrendered. And when, on the 6th of January, finally the East India Company troops, again, you've got to remember these are very largely Indian sepoys from Bihar and UP who'd never seen snow before, who were completely ill-equipped for winter warfare. As soon as they began to march, the ambushes began, and of the 25,000 men, women, children, and camp followers who left Kabul on the 6th of January, 1842, in legend at least, only one man made it through, Dr. Bryden from the Black Isle on his nag, and he only survived because he, being a good Edinburgh man, he had a copy of Blackwood's magazine, produced in the Fair City of Edinburgh, which he tucked into his forage cap. And so when they came for him with their talwars, their swords, it sliced through the spine of Blackwood's, but the binding was sufficiently good. In those days, Edinburgh bookbinders were famous for their craft, and it took the blow and didn't go into his skull. So Dr. Bryden made that alone, and is to this day buried opposite Fort St. George on the shores of the Beauly Firth, in Rose Marquee, if you ever find yourself in those parts. But anyway, so the fact that an entire army, in fact, there were a few other survivors, a few hundred Gurkhas, for example, knew what to do in the snow and came in a few days later, having hidden in a cave. There were other sepoys who made it back to India on foot and disguised themselves as Sadhu and so on. But in principle, at least, the story is true that an entire British army, although populated largely by North Indian soldiers, was destroyed. And this remained a cautionary tale that resonated down the centuries. And allegedly, to come back to your question, when Harold Macmillan took over from Eden, the advice was, you'll be fine, old boy, as long as you don't invade Afghanistan.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm going to hand over to Olga now, who I know has some questions for you. And I'm particularly interested to hear what your view is of the present situation and what happens in the future. Your reference to the Chinese is interesting, and that's been quoted on a number of occasions. And this so-called Durand Line, which of course no self-respecting Pashtun pays any attention to, and whether that well-known cricketer, who we thought was quite civilized in Pakistan, has a role to play, named Imran Khan. But Olga, could I hand over to you?
Happy to answer all those questions.
Well, I hope you will, William, but I'm just going to tweak slightly the mention about China, because I've been watching with total fascination. As you say, soft power has been extraordinary, but will that relationship endure? Now, the upside is the Chinese are non-judgmental. They are not going to hassle them, the Taliban, about human rights, and that's probably be in their favor. On the other hand, they have made it very clear that the Afghans must control the Uyghur population and not export any terrorism to China. Will that work? Is that relationship going to endure? Chinese are pretty wily, but non-interference in political systems around the world has been their calling card and been very successful. And I guess with that, they'll probably get the lion's share of exploiting all the minerals. What do you reckon?
So I happened, funny enough, I think, to stumble on the beginnings of this relationship between China and the Taliban when I was in Shanghai about 5 years ago, and I met a couple of friends from Washington, shall we say, who were in a bar, they. I said, what on earth are you doing here? And it turned out there was this big Washington delegation, intelligence delegation, coming to chat to the Chinese about them playing a role at that stage. The Americans encouraged the Chinese to try and find a peace solution. So the Chinese, I think, are kept well out of Afghanistan, anxious, as you rightly say, about their restive Uyghur populations, of which they have now taken quite extraordinary punitive measures against in one of the largest human rights violations of our time. But certainly after Trump legitimized the Taliban by allowing the Qatar office to open, and to open with a flag flying on it, and to have the status of a diplomatic mission, all of which were diplomatic failures in my view, and none of which should have been conceded. And then to open full negotiations, and then finally the crowning mistake after which everything else followed, which was the announcement of a timetable for American withdrawal. From that point, other nations, including Russia and China, have opened negotiations with the Taliban diplomatic team in Qatar, so the first public sign of this was about a month before Kabul fell, when there was a Taliban delegation to Beijing that was photographed in public.
Oh, I remember seeing that.
With these extraordinary photographs of these big burly Taliban standing beside neatly suited Chinese officials. And the Chinese had obviously had the whole thing hammered out, because as soon as the Americans disappeared, within 2 days, the Taliban were saying on television that their biggest ally was going to be China. There was talk of loans. There have been enormous donations of vaccines, the Chinese vaccine, which apparently doesn't work very well, but the Afghans have got very little option. And this has continued, and we've had several broadcasts now out of Kabul by the Taliban announcing the closeness of the Chinese and how they're going to be the big power. So when you've had a lot of talk on the television about the world community will not allow this and will not allow that, I'm afraid it doesn't mean a thing. What it actually means is that the West doesn't want it. It doesn't mean the world community has agreed on this at all, because the Chinese are, as you say, very willing to keep business and politics at some length from each other. And the Chinese model, by which they offer enormous loans for major infrastructure projects, which are often then defaulted on, and then assets are slowly taken in return for. I was recently in Sri Lanka in April, and it's very interesting. The whole of the Colombo port is now, not the whole of Colombo port, but about 3/4 of Colombo port is now in Chinese control, as is the deep water port of Trincomalee. And this is all in return for Chinese loans, which took place during the Civil War, when the country was committing human rights abuses, and the West was not willing to provide funding. And the only two nations that were providing support were Iran and China. The end result, 15 years later, is that the main ports in Sri Lanka are now Chinese submarine bases. So on the same basis, I think we can imagine very confidently that there's going to be large-scale Chinese infrastructure projects, which then will eventually lead to concessions in territorial terms, whether it's mineral deposits or something else. We can imagine, and I mean, what's quite clear though, is that the real geopolitical significance of the last month has been Afghanistan passing from American hegemony to that of China. And that's probably irreversible, I think, in our time. I would be very surprised. The other big losers, obviously, all the allies who put troops in, including ourselves, over the last few years, who've left corpses and bodies and dead soldiers in Afghanistan. The Indians, all their strategy built on the success, on allying with the Karzai government against Pakistan. That's now in tatters. Pakistan considers itself triumphant. The whole of Pakistan seems to be very united in seeing this as even my most moderate and liberal Pakistani friends are regarding this as one in the eye for India, and are crowing with various degrees of pleasure or smugness at what they certainly regard as a major strategic victory for Pakistan. The old pretense that Pakistan had nothing to do with the Taliban, which no one ever doubted, that because the Quetta Shura was obviously in Quetta. I've written a long paper which is still online in Brookings called The Deadly Triangle, about what the whole situation in Afghanistan is really an outflow of the terrible relationship post-partition of 1947 between India and Pakistan. And Pakistan has this, Pakistan Army has this doctrine of strategic depth that because there's probably no way they can stop an Indian army marching into Lahore over the Punjab, because of the hugely greater size of the Indian army. Pakistan's best hope is to withdraw to a friendly government in Afghanistan and pull back, and what they call strategic depth. And obviously this was not going to be granted by the Karzai government or Ashraf Ghani, but the Taliban, they fondly believe, will do so. That, incidentally, is by no means a certainty. And I think one of the things that's very clear is that this extraordinary double game, which Pakistan has been playing very successfully, receiving at once millions of pounds of American weaponry, while sheltering and training and keeping safe the Taliban leadership. That has, to a certain extent, been obviously remarkably successful. On the other hand, a lot of the current Taliban leadership has spent time in Pakistani jails being tortured by the ISI and black sites, including some of the most senior figures in the new government. And obviously, these are things you don't forget. And I think some commentators probably overestimate the degree to which the Taliban feels gratitude to Pakistan. I've never met a Taliban who have ever expressed anything except deep hatred of Pakistan. In fact, all Afghans have a very, very uneasy relationship with Pakistan, whether they were refugees or it's an extremely complicated relationship. So whether the Pakistani relationship with the Taliban will be as rosy as no doubt the Chinese one will be is not a certainty. As for Imran Khan, I'm not neutral here. He's an old friend. Thank you very much. I've seen him recently. And of course, the real power, certainly in terms of foreign policy, is the army, not the civilian government. And the unspoken pact in Pakistan is that prime ministers have control really over domestic policy, but it's the ISI and the army that really control what goes on in Afghanistan, particularly. In a sense, it's not primarily his fault or primarily his even responsibility, in that he would not be allowed to form a policy that was hugely at variance with the army, the Faujis, or the ISI. But I think as far as I could tell from public statements, he seems genuinely thrilled that this is what he regards as a Pakistani victory. He talked about the Afghans being freed from slavery, and to his credit, at least publicly, he's made lots of noises about urging the Taliban to respect the rights of women, the rights of musicians, and the rights of minorities. And when, for example, the ultra-conservative, hardline, military, rural, all Pashtun, all male government was announced 2 weeks ago, Imran Khan did go publicly out and say that they needed to, this is an interim government, when they formed the permanent government, he said they need to make it more representative for different, Pashtuns only make up 40% of Afghans. So he was encouraging them to include other communities. And I think, that if anyone that wants this current government, Taliban government, to succeed, would urge them, I would imagine, to create a more diverse government, because if it remains all male, all Pashtun, all rural, all ultra conservative, it's not going to appeal to more than a rural conservative hardline minority, and sooner or later they will see the whole thing fall apart. And indeed, there have been reports of internal conflict and shooting in the ARG and all sorts of things in the last few weeks.
Well, it is a very, yeah.
Olga, sorry, I was just going to say, we've got a lot of questions, I know, in the Q&A in the chat.
Bring them all in.
So bring them on. So Martin, would you like to select people, perhaps in groups, and ask some questions, get their questions asked? That would be great. Thank you, Olga, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. William, we normally moderate these for everyone answering the questions. So as you've been talking, I've been pulling a few together. I wonder if we could go to the starting point, which is a very basic one from A. Adityanji, who's asked, William, what is the etymological origin of the word Afghanistan? And that's not such a simple question, obviously, because I think coming on from that, it'd be nice to go back to Roddy's earlier question of, is there really a country called Afghanistan, and will such a country survive in the future?
Well, you have I mean, in ancient times, the West called Afghanistan Ariana, but you have from the Middle Ages talk of Afghans, and the land of the Afghans is a phrase used a lot. By the time Mount Stuart Elphinstone turns up, who was the far brighter original Elphinstone, who did the Elphinstone expedition in 1809, they talk about the kingdom of Kabul, but the land of the Afghans. And it's really only in the 1850s or the late 1840s, in the aftermath of the first Afghan war, that the term Afghanistan gains widespread currency. It is a fairly recent coinage. The Elphinstone, I say, talks about the kingdom of Kabul. And so yes, it's not a term that has an ancient history.
Is it going to be a country, do you think, that can survive?
Well, as I say, it's a country whose borders have remained stable for 150 years, which is more than can be said of most of the countries in Europe.
Sure.
And certainly not France or Germany or Belgium. But it's a country which has always been hugely decentralized and has resisted centralized power. So that there will be a space on the map called Afghanistan is I think pretty likely for the foreseeable future. That there will be a coherent government operating out of Kabul, which has strong control over every valley, is extremely unlikely.
Just moving on from that, Sheila, I think, has asked a very important question as well, and she joins our sessions quite regularly. Her fundamental question is, why does anyone think they have a right to Afghanistan? Why do people think they have to conquer the country? What about the people whose country it is? Just going on from that, what would you say, or how would you say, have we made a mistake from the West in how we've approached this? Because obviously, the counterterrorism strategy that's being utilized by the USA, by the UK, and our allies in NATO is through a very Western prism. And back to Sheila's question, you know, why do we have a right to Afghanistan? Have we approached this in completely the wrong way?
Well, there's two different questions there. So do we have a right to Afghanistan? Clearly not. Clearly the people that live there have a right to Afghanistan. And I think there's for all the fractures, for all the many different ideas of what Afghanistan may mean, I think most Afghans regard themselves as Afghan. There's very few people I've ever met who still want the want the Durran line abolished and to join with Pakistan. I mean, I understand that was a very popular thing in the 50s and 60s and earlier, but I have never met anyone outside the Khan Abdul Wali Khan family that talks seriously about Pashtunistan anymore. That idea seems to be dead on the ground. So yes, the Afghans have a right to Afghanistan. Was our regime a legitimate, democratically elected regime? Well, lots of people would dispute that. There was very widespread vote stuffing and widespread allegations of corruption at the elections, particularly in the last one with Ashraf Ghani. I've heard many people say that Ashraf Ghani got less than a third of the vote. How far that's true, I just don't know. But you can certainly make a case for the fact that we imposed a government on Afghanistan that was kept in power by ballot stuffing. Yes, you can say that. So you can certainly argue that our regime was in all sorts of ways illegitimate. What was the second half of the question?
Well, perhaps I could ask that second half of the question in relation to someone from the audience, because there are more informed people than me, I think, in the audience. So Kaleem Hussain was asking, what are your views about the Western concept of attempting to undertake nation-building exercises in countries like Afghanistan? I think this comes on to what I was talking about with counterterrorism. Are we approaching this in completely the wrong way?
Well, I have to say that the model that the Chinese seem to be using, which is to offer loans, to build infrastructure, and to regard foreign policy as a way of extending your business interests, sounds like a more widely applicable model today than what we're trying. But could this have succeeded? I think there were moments it could have succeeded. And Hamid Karzai was a very remarkable choice for premier, and Karzai had huge charm and amazing ability to pull people into a very big tent. He was extraordinarily polite. I've seen him in the palace in Kabul go and embrace tribal elders who walked in from the country, touching their feet, urging them to sit down. Well, Ashraf Ghani, who I also knew very well, was much more the sort of he would tell some poor old man that had walked in from Logar or Uruzgan or somewhere that he had 5 minutes. That's just not the way it operates in Afghanistan. It's not a World Bank office. And Karzai did have this ability to unite people. He created a government that had representation from all the ethnic groups, where women were represented. He was extremely popular. The people he was less popular with, of course, were the Americans, because he kept denouncing the fact that the American Air Force was astonishingly bad, as I think it's always been, at targeting its enemies, and instead blowing up thousands of innocent villagers in their very ill-informed hunts for their targets. And we saw that obviously in the very last day of the American occupation, when they blew up a family heading to the airport to escape, rather than a bunch of Islamic State operatives that they thought were in the van. So I think throughout the occupation, the trigger-happy drone spree that the Americans operated was entirely counterproductive, and Karzai was very, very critical of it. And he said, "This is destroying the credibility of my government. This is destroying the credibility of your presence here," and he urged them to get out. He didn't want them to leave in quite the way that Biden did, by just announcing a date and and pulling out. Someone's just come up with, how significant do you think Daesh will be? I think that this Taliban government, is full of complete ultra-conservative Islamist monsters, many of whom have been radicalized in Pakistani prisons and have been badly tortured with all the psychological damage that is likely to have inflicted on them. And they are friends particularly with Al-Qaeda. There are many family and kinship ties now between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They're intermarried in many clans. I understand from what I've read in reports that there is a significant Daesh presence too, but they are not allies with either the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. This kind of thing, one only has to rely on intelligence reports, and one never knows how accurate they are. I mean, judging by the drones, drone strikes, the CIA had very little idea of what was going on and was blowing up the wrong people the whole time.
Willie, a question for you quickly about Osama bin Laden. When Osama bin Laden was in Tora Bora, and they knew he was there, and when special forces and others were closing in and could have got him, and Donald Rumsfeld blinked and they let him go, was that a critical point? Do you think if they'd got Osama bin Laden all those years ago, 20 years ago, whatever it was, all this could have been avoided?
No, I don't think it could have been at all, because
Okay.
the point was not the survival of Al-Qaeda, which has been very effectively degraded. It's the effectiveness of the Taliban, which was safe and sound under ISI custodianship in Quetta and elsewhere. And as soon as the Pakistanis were clearly supporting and protecting the Taliban, which was, I mean, the best work on this is the various successor books that Ahmed Rashid wrote for his initial Taliban, Descent into Chaos, and there are 2 or 3 others that he wrote, which give chapter and verse about the way the Pakistani establishment protected, sheltered, armed, and funded the Taliban from about, from late 2001. And as long as those guys were operating, there was always going to be a threat. But there's no question that the mismanagement of Afghanistan, and particularly the drone attacks, created enormous sympathy for the Taliban and created a larger and larger constituency. The other factor we haven't talked about is ethnic, and this is something I make a great deal of in Return of a King, which of course I'm very happy to hold up and encourage everyone to buy. In 1839 to 42, the British put onto the throne Shah Shuja ul Mulk, who was the head of the Popelzai tribe, and the Popelzai are the ruling dynasty, the Sadrzai dynasty, and their enemies have always been the Ghilzai tribe, who are the ultra-conservative, dispossessed people from around, particularly Kandahar. They are the sharecroppers, the part-time workers on other people's land, basically the poor. And today, Karzai is a direct descendant of Shah Shuja, also head of the Popelzai tribe today, while the foot soldiers of the Taliban and their leaders, Mullah Omar, are Hotaki Ghilzai. So underneath the very different world of different flags and the different dresses that we dress this up as being democracy against Islamism and all the rest of it, it's still the same basic Afghan cleavage, tribal cleavage that we had in 1842. Of Ghilzai against Duranis or Popelzai. Mullah Omar's family were the chief of the Hotaki Ghilzai, and they are still today. And they are the foot soldiers of the Taliban. So there's a whole tribal element, which we haven't talked about too, to this, which ongoing tribal rivalries.
William, could firstly, to link that, how far do those tribal rivalries extend into Pakistan? And could I then link that to a question from Jonathan Ritchie, which I think is an important one at this time? How seriously should we take John Bolton's comments regarding the increased risk of Pakistan falling to the Taliban and the nuclear arsenal going with it? I'm not suggesting that John Bolton makes the most informed comments.
I was about to say, John Bolton's an arse, and I wouldn't listen to a thing he says, and he's never been to any of these places, doesn't know the first thing, and has backed the wrong horse.
Pakistan.
No, as I say, I mean, I've read endlessly in books about how the Durand Line is a figment of the imagination and has no meaning. But in the 30 years I've been in the region, I've met virtually no one who doesn't feel strongly Pakistani or Afghan. And the Afghans tend to have a rather negative attitude to the Pakistanis. So what was clearly the case, judging by books I've read in earlier years, where the Durand Line was a figment of the imperial imagination, I think has hardened into a real national border now, as far as I can tell. I mean, there's tribal intermarriage and stuff over the lines, and people move freely between the two. But by and large, I think people do feel quite strongly Afghan or Pakistani, and with all, just like how Scots nationalism has survived despite 300 years of the Union. Possibly in spite of the Union. I might be wrong about this, but certainly in my travels, I have not felt that Pakistan is in any danger of losing its identity into one big amorphous Pashtun megastate. That may be what the ISI would love or dream of, I don't know, but I haven't seen any sign of it on the ground. No, I haven't.
I mean, William, you know the tribal breakdown of Afghanistan extremely well, obviously for a Westerner, but and you obviously understand.
For a Westerner, is an important footnote there, because whenever any expert on expert inverted commas Afghanistan holds forth, we have vague ideas of some of the contours, and But as soon as you go there, there's so many complexities and rivalries that I think very, very few people, certainly not me, know the detail of it. But yeah, the broad outlines.
But what does this mean for the future of people in Afghanistan, and especially under Taliban rule? If Taliban rule continues, I mean, what do you see will be the fate of people now, with the fate of women, the fate of children, etc.? And Elizabeth Marshall is asking this, and I think it's important to bring it back to real people. Clearly, the Taliban do not believe in birth control or the education of women. Do you think this will exacerbate the numbers of starving children? What do you see is happening next in Pakistan, women and children?
So I mean, I think it's disastrous at the moment, and I suspect that it would be much worse if we end up putting sanctions on Afghanistan, because I mean, I got various friends, for example, who are doing business in Afghanistan. I got one friend who is an Armenian from the Middle East, who of American passport, who has very profitable business exporting mulberries and nuts out of Afghanistan, and they have very fancy packaging, which is done in a factory in Kabul, and they sell it at huge markup to health food shops in California. Now, I know that he's had it almost impossible to get his exports out this year. He's found it almost impossible to get the money together because the banks are all closed to pay the people harvesting his mulberries and his almonds and all the things he likes to sell. So even the very few viable businesses that potentially could have continued operating despite the arrival of a new regime have found that it's impossible to import, export, get anything done, or borrow money, pay people, any of those things. And even if some of those problems are ironed out in the next few months, it's very difficult to see the parlous state of the Afghan economy, particularly without the large quantities of American aid pouring in, getting any better. I mean, it's always been one of the poorest countries in the world. It will only get much, much poorer now. And so ideas of education and birth control and all that have gone completely out the window. And the only thing that's stopping a mass exodus of refugees is that the borders are closed. The Iranians are only letting in some Shia. The Turks have said they're not letting anyone in. The Pakistanis have said they're not letting anyone in. They've already got 1 million Afghans from the last round. And so I think it's going to be very difficult for Afghans who want to get out unless we give them visas and they can fly out. No Western government has offered more than a few thousand. Even the Canadians, who I think have offered the most, have offered 20,000, which is obviously a tiny proportion of the amount of people. I think we have a huge moral obligation to at least get out not only interpreters and people whose lives have been made impossible because of helping us, and we have to help them, but also special interest groups such as musicians who are now going to starve and are being targeted and assassinated by the Taliban. And a campaign was launched yesterday. People can look on the campaign for Afghan musicians, which we're trying to persuade our government to give a large number of visas to that community, who if not helped, the whole Afghan musical tradition will die. So no, I think things are extremely grim. They're grim from every point of view. They're grim for the Afghans. It's miserable geopolitically for Americans, the British, the Indians, everyone who had an interest in the survival of the old government. It is unlikely that this regime, if it remains as narrowly based as with hardline rural ultra-conservative mullahs from one set of tribes, if it remains like that, almost certainly we'll see civil war adding to all the other issues going on at the moment. I'm extremely pessimistic, and it was all pretty well avoidable. The Taliban were a ragtag bunch of, a very brave but underfunded, underarmed hooligans from the villages, and it would not have been difficult to have kept the Afghan army if you hadn't completely destroyed morale by leaving in the way the Americans left, by, for example, leaving 6,000 cars at Bagram Air Base, but taking the keys. That kind of thing is so stupid and so counterproductive that you saw that immediately the result was that the Afghans just threw down their weapons and ran the army. No one fought.
On that geopolitical point, perhaps Olga, from Defence and Security Forum, it is a dire geopolitical situation. Would you like to add anything?
Well, it is a dire situation. What really concerns me is clearly, I think Kabul will not be able to control the whole country. I think that's come out in our conversation with William. So you're going to have a lot of disparate elements. I'd like to know, a question came up about the Russian engagement. I do remember that when the Russians withdrew, they said to the Americans, if you want any help, we'll guide you. We'll tell you what's at stake. Clearly that didn't happen, but the Russians are coming back simply to protect their own interests rather than, I think, to trying to manipulate the Taliban. But we are into a totally new game. And I think the idea that we're going to be able to talk to one government is, as William described, with all these different tribes, is going to be a very tough call. So in the end, we'll never know who actually to deal with. And it probably will implode. But how, I don't know. Maybe William can have a view on that. And also about the Russians.
So there's, as I understand it, there are divisions within the Taliban between the negotiating team in Doha, who are relatively moderate and relatively intelligent, and the Eastern and Western military commands on the ground, who are the guys that seem to have won out in the latest governmental shuffle. And again, the Quetta Shura. And the guys who seem to have got the plum jobs in the new government are the military commanders on the ground. And we've seen Barada and a lot of the leaders of the Doha factions given much more junior jobs than they'd hoped for. We've seen tensions arising from that, and there are all the usual tribal tensions. So, yeah, I'd say that if I was a betting man, I'd probably say that that some form of civil war and a breakup of this government into competing factions, rather like the pre-Taliban Mujahideen period, when Dostum was fighting, and the other lot were shelling Masood was shelling Kabul from the Panjshir, and all that sort of stuff was going on. It's such a tragedy, and such an easily avoidable tragedy. The only remote hope, I think, is that the Chinese will somehow manage to use their economic muscle to bind the country together, to turn it into a functioning economy, and as a satrap of the huge growing China. I mean, China is the central fact of geopolitics today. People forget that I think as recently as 2004, China was the same size as the UK economy. Now it's 7 times the size in just 16 years. The speed with which China is racing away and overtaking everyone else, I don't think has even begun to dawn on most people. And the way that Europe's influence is diminishing, Brexit obviously has not helped that, is incredibly striking. And the age of America is proving remarkably resilient economically and militarily, but this is a major setback. People like Taiwan who are looking for American aid are going to be very worried after seeing the way that Biden just withdrew and screwed over his allies.
William, we actually we have an event coming up soon, I hope, on indebted Chinese companies. So I hope you're listening to that one.
I will listen in. It's not a subject I know a huge amount about, but I'd be very, very interested to hear it.
But before I hand back to Roddy, I have one very important question from Jonathan Ritchie. It says, William, I'm ashamed to say I've not yet read your books. If I was
Shame on you, Jonathan Ritchie.
Yes, if I was going to read one right now, which one should it be? So of course, I'm going to answer buy all of them, but which one should you?
I would indeed encourage you to buy all of them, and it has the last 4 have just come out as a box set. The Company Quartet, which is available on Amazon and the good bookshop near you. But obviously, the Afghan one is Return of a King, and this is the one that draws the parallels between the Second Afghan War and the current situation. The most recent of them was the Anarchy. It's certainly the best-selling and probably best reviewed of them. Which is about the East India Company and drawing parallels with the East India Company and modern mega corporations today.
Thank you very much, William. But the most fascinating fact I heard from you today was that Dr. Bryden came from the Black Isle, which I didn't know. And having grown up in Aberdeenshire, I used to look at the Black Isle very often from the farm where I was. And what people used to say was, if you can't see the Black Isle, it's raining. And if you can see the Black Isle, it's going to rain. So I think that's why Dr. Bryden probably left. But,
That's why we all leave.
Yes, that's true. Roddy, if I may hand back to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And thank you, Olga, for your questions and helping us on the panel, and all the people who've been listening to this, as usual, quite remarkable talk by Willie. Willie, I have read The Anarchy, and I can say to anybody, read it first, and then The Set is a very, very good book stop as well. So it's a dual purpose thing, but it's a very, very interesting book. And of course, the influence of the Scots in this particular part of the world is something that at the Age of Scotland Institute, it was our genesis, really, that we felt that there should be an institute that would encourage, inspire, and educate tomorrow's leaders in Scotland to re-engage with a part of the world, which, as you know very, very well, many of their forebears played a role in, for good, mainly, or for ill. And people used to say to me when I was young, go west, young man. And now we say, look and go east, young person. Willie, you've shared your time sitting there in Oxford with us for over an hour, and we're hugely grateful to you. I can't believe there's a single person on this Zoom, this webinar, who hasn't learned a great deal. And we are immensely grateful to you for your time and your kindness in sharing your thoughts on a very troubled part of the world with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Roddy, and thank you, Olga. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, William.